So today I'm going to be talking about chapters 1, 2, and 13 in our assessment techniques book. Chapter 1 is over the classroom decision making and using assessments. As far as assessments and classroom decisions go, they're everywhere. Sometimes we don't even realize that we're making assessments or decisions because we do it so often. Assessments contribute to a decision, but that doesn't necessarily mean that based on those results, a certain outcome will happen. For instance, even though a child passes kindergarten, the parents may decide to hold them back. Now, good classroom decisions come into play, and you have to say what you're going to teach, how you're going to teach it, how to evaluate it, and then you have to use high-quality assessments in order to make good classroom decisions. And then also you have to gather and use information, and based on those assessments, you'll decide what you need to do. Alright, there are many types of decisions. There's instructional decisions, like what am I going to teach? There are questions before you begin. So what do I need? What are the students' abilities? You have to ask these questions because you can't start to teach a lesson and then not have the materials that you need, or even as far as student abilities go, that means like you can't teach calculus to a kindergartner. There's just no way. Alright, so then we have during the lesson, what should I do better? Is my lesson going well? And based on what you decide, you may have to readjust right then and say, well, I'm not going to do this anymore, or let's go a little deeper. And then we have after your lesson, should I reteach it? Was it effective? And these are just sample questions. There are so many more that you need to ask yourself. I think in the text it said that we make teachers make about 20 decisions per class period. So that is a lot. Okay, and then there's also selection decisions. For instance, Harvard. Yes, I accept you. No, I do not. Placement decisions. Which order are you going to be? And then we have classification systems, and that's not necessarily an order. And then we have decisions about grades. Should I give this person an A? Did they do the work well enough to achieve an A? Did they do work for a C? You have to take all of that into consideration. And then also there's credentializing, and you have to decide whether someone gets their credentials based on the actions that they've done. For instance, if you're trying to get CDLs, you have to pass a test by demonstrating your credentials. Or you can do a different way, like for us, our degrees, we don't get them until we've completed so many hours in certain courses. Okay, and then we have feedback. Feedback is very important to the students and the teachers. It's important to give students feedback because you need to tell them what they're doing well and what they're not doing well. And then also, you need to give yourself feedback. You need to ask yourself if what you're doing is working. Also, the assessments that you've done on the students will tell you if you need to adjust how you teach them. Okay? Next, distinctions among vocabulary. And these words are assessment, test, and evaluation. Now, many people interchangeably, but actually they each have their own definition. Assessments is a process for obtaining information for making decisions. Okay? It's kind of broad. Now, a test is an instrument or a systematic procedure for observing and describing one or more characteristic of a student using a numerical scale or classification scheme. We all know what a test is, but the numerical scale is what narrows it down. Okay, measurement, and that is a procedure for assigning numbers to a specified attribute or characteristic of a person in such a way that the numbers describe the degree to which the person possesses the attribute. I think the example in the book says that you get 1 point for each correct answer. Have evaluation. That is the process of making a value judgment about the worth of a student's product or performance. Now, this doesn't necessarily have to be an individual. It can be a school or a group of people. It doesn't have to be an individual. Okay, next we have type of assessments. Some of the ones we've learned so far are formative and summative. Formative is ongoing. You're constantly making these assessments. Now summative, those are at the end of the unit, the end of the term, just at the end. Now, these are not to be used negatively. And by that, I mean that don't use them as punishment. Many times, teachers use them as you have to pass this or you're not going to pass my class or something to that effect, maybe not that drastic, but then they get a negative connotation associated with them. So try not to use summative assessments negatively. And then there's sizing up, and that's basically you just kind of look and see what you think that the student is capable of. Okay, and then we go on to high stakes testing, and then we have accountability testing. So people are accountable for the results, and this came into play during No Child Left Behind, and I think we're still using it today. And then there's also a disaggregation of test results, and that's where we break it down into groups. We make sure that each group is learning, not just the dominant group or not just a certain group. We make sure that all the groups are learning. Okay? And then we move on to chapter 2, and that is describing the goals of instruction. Now, there's an importance of specifying learning outcomes, and in that section it talks about a learning objective and what it is, and that's what do you want the students to have achieved when the unit is over. And then you decide what the students are to learn, and then you teach them, and then you evaluate the learning. And that's how you deal with learning objectives. So, and if the learning, when you evaluate the learning, if it's not well enough or not good enough, then you may have to reteach the. Okay, and then we go to Common Core. Many states have adopted Common Core now. They're math and literacy standards, and then there's also content standards that are worked in, and you can find all of that on the ADU website. Standards are statements about what students are expected to learn. And since all of these standards have been adopted, that puts everybody on the same track. Everybody knows what the students are supposed to learn and when they're supposed to learn it. Common Core is about going deeper into the material rather than knowing a mass amount of material, but actually knowing about the material that you're taught. Okay? And then from the standards, we are to derive the learning goals, and that goes back to the learning objectives. And then you're supposed to create assessments, and you have to make sure that your assessments are as rigorous and as relevant as your instruction is or your teaching, and you have to make sure that it fits the standards. Alright, there are different taxonomies of instructional learning objectives: cognitive domain, affective domain, and psychomotor domain. And the cognitive domain is knowledge and the abilities of the students. The affective domain is the feelings, interests, and attitudes of the students. And then the psychomotor domain is the motor skills and perceptual processes. Okay? And then it talks about Bloom's, the revised Bloom's. There's 6 levels, and it said that if you use the Bloom's table, it will show you each level of thought for that question, and it just keeps going deeper and deeper. And we can't start the students at the top. It's not one of those kind of charts. You have to start at the bottom and work your way up to the top. Okay, but when you get to the top, then the students will really know what they're talking about. Okay, how to write objectives. You can have a student-centered objective, a performance-centered, or a content-centered objective. And if it's student-centered, it's more about the student. If it's a performance-centered, then it's more about what the student can do when they finish the lesson. And then we have content-centered, which is what content they will know when we finish. And when you're writing the objectives, make sure that you use specific verbs and you align the objectives to the standards. Since all of these states have adopted the standards, like Arkansas has, you have to know that what you're teaching is actually going to help them either with a summative assessment like standardized testing or just in real life. Okay, chapter 13, and that's performance and portfolio assessments. A performance task is an assessment activity that requires demonstration. So some people use performance assessments and performance tasks interchangeably, like the vocabulary, but they're not. A performance assessment can be many things, whereas the performance task is what you actually assign the student to do. Okay, and then we have an authentic assessment, and that is an assessment that is directly meaningful to the student. And then we have an alternative assessment, and this just means that it's not a standardized test. And many people use authentic and alternative assessments interchangeably as well, but they're not necessarily interchangeable. Okay? And when you're doing performance assessments, you have to make sure that you use rubrics, and that's just a rating scale, and it lets the students know what they have to do to get what score. Okay. There's many types of performance assessments. There's on-demand tasks, constructed responses, equipment assessments, that's like maybe using a microscope in a lab, demonstrations, naturally occurring. Those assessments usually happen on the playground, maybe to see how this student is interacting with other students just on a normal basis. There's long-term assessments, like maybe a research paper or a research project. There's experiments. There's oral presentations, maybe a speech or a skit. There's simulations where the environment is controlled and you see what they do in that controlled environment. And then there's also computerized adaptive scenarios where when they click on one thing or they make one decision, it depends on where they go, like what the next step is. Okay? There are many advantages. Performance assessments can clarify the meaning of complex learning objectives. They can assess the ability to do. It shows you what the student can do. They're consistent with modern theory, so it's really accepted right now. It can be linked closely with teaching activities. It broadens the approach to assessment, so sometimes the students don't even know that they're being assessed, so it takes a lot of the pressure off. Because some students do have test anxiety, so it will take off some of the pressure. It shows the teacher the process that the student went through to get the result. So not only are you assessing the outcome, but you're also assessing how they got there, the process. Also, it requires an integration of knowledge and skills and abilities of the student. So that is very important. I think that's the key advantage right there. And then we also have disadvantages. They're difficult to create because you need to have them rigorous and relevant enough. It requires time for completion from the students. It takes the students more time than a test would. Scoring takes more time than normal. There's a lower reliability. One task does not equal another. Just because a student did well on one task doesn't mean that they're going to do well on another task. And the lower reliability comes from two teachers may have the same student, but if they have different expectations, then the student may make different grades when he or she did the same amount of work. Okay? Another disadvantage is you cannot assess all objectives at once. So you have to give a performance assessment for your first objective, for your second objective. So that takes even more time. And then sometimes it discourages the less able. So the students who don't think they can, they really don't want to, so they may not even try. And then it can underrepresent many of the groups. So some of the groups could have done better maybe, but they didn't have the knowledge that maybe the dominant group did in order to achieve this. So that was chapter 1, 2, and 13, and thank you for listening to my video.